For Session Update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. DFL representatives called a press conference to begin a conversation towards the decriminalization of recreational marijuana use in Minnesota. The lawmakers have introduced several proposals, including a constitutional amendment that would end the state's prohibition on personal use and cultivation. Here's that press conference.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. So I am Representative Tina Liebling from Rochester, and I have with me three of my colleagues who will introduce themselves. I think we're all going to want to address you today, but we're here to just give you all an opportunity to ask questions about the proposals that we have made. We have really three different but related proposals. All of us are interested in removing the prohibition on personal use of cannabis in Minnesota. We think that it's time. There are at least now 8 states that have done this. Many more have medical marijuana programs, as we do here in the state. But we've all come to the conclusion that prohibition of personal use of cannabis creates a lot of harms in Minnesota that can be avoided by removing the prohibition. The harms that it causes are many. We can talk about in many different areas, all the way from criminal justice, putting people who need marijuana and buy it on the black market into contact with a criminal element that could be avoided if they could buy their marijuana legally, and numerous other things. We now have a lot of experience in other states that we can draw from. I do want to be clear that all of us believe that a lot of discussion needs to take place around this policy, because every state that has done this has wrestled with a lot of the finer points of how to regulate or how to minimize the possible harms from personal use of marijuana, how to structure or allow the industry to be structured, and so on. So there are a lot of questions that we will need to be wrestling with as the conversation moves forward. But the point of all of our bills is really to open the conversation, because we do believe that Minnesotans are asking for this. There's been a real change in attitude across the country. There's been a change in attitude across Minnesota, and all of us have received a lot of communications from our constituents and from people across the state that this is a change that they are looking for. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues and let them speak, and then we are mainly here to answer your questions. Thank you.
So, my name's Representative, or title Representative. Name is Jason Metsa, and I represent the District 6B up on the Iron Range. And the bill that will have a House file later today is a constitutional amendment to essentially legalize cannabis for personal use in the state of Minnesota. And we have some enacting language, which I worked with Representative Applebaum on, that models some of the Colorado language out there. And I would just echo what Representative Liebling said. This is a conversation starter. We are all well aware that our colleagues who are chairs that would give these bills hearings are not interested in having this conversation right now. But you have to have a starting point. And what I've heard from my constituents is, we want you to be bold and take on issues that have social justice, and impacts on the lives of so many people who may have done this in the past, personally using. Lots of people have got away with it, and some, unfortunately, have gotten caught and prosecuted, and it holds them back from things like having a job for the recreational use that they might have done in college, unknowing that this would follow them their whole life. And so we believe it's a starting point. In fact, right after the press conference here, I have a meeting with one of our state's leading experts on how do you regulate this in terms of driving under the influence. So we want to get all this input from people all over the state, whether you're opposed, for, neutral on the issue. This is a starting point for a conversation. And thank you all for coming today, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Representative Applebaum.
Hi, Jon Applebaum, District 44B, Minnetonka, second term. I'm also a deputy minority leader for the DFL House Caucus. A lot of interest in this topic yesterday since our press release was put out. As Representative Metsa said, he and I have very similar bills that will be introduced on the House floor today for the full legalization of the personal and recreational use of marijuana here in the state of Minnesota for persons age 21 and older. There's a variety of reasons, some of which Representative Liebling and Representative Metsa touched on, but one that I'd like to share a little bit about today is just the billion-dollar opportunity that we have here in the state of Minnesota to create a made-in-Minnesota economy whereby Minnesota farmers can grow cannabis products, Minnesota businesses can distribute cannabis, and Minnesota small businesses can sell it. In the 8 states in Washington, D.C. that have enacted this already, economic boons for those in place, such as Colorado and Washington, have been demonstrated, and we can do that very same thing right here in the state of Minnesota. Marijuana use has been happening for a very long time. Anywhere from 10 to 20% of Minnesotans use it regularly, so we should capitalize on it, make sure that it's safe, and it can add some much needed tax revenues for our state so we can fund some truly important things like public schools and give Minnesota families property tax relief. So, answered a lot of questions yesterday. I have nothing prepared here today. Representative Hausman, if you'd like to talk, but feel free to ask me anything. I'm happy to answer all your questions. Thank you.
And I just want to highlight one specific, very practical thing in the lives of people. I've been involved in this issue with some grassroots organizing and bringing in speakers. You may remember Joycelyn Elders, so we've been organizing around it. But today I want to focus on one particular issue. Some of you know that I have spent a huge amount of effort in the last few years on housing for those who don't have a safe place to sleep at night. And the more you're involved in that, the more you realize we have to be very careful who we incarcerate and why, because we affect the rest of their life, their ability to get a job and their ability to find a place to live. Today is Narrow Day on the Hill. Those are public housing people and others. I just spoke to them up on the 3rd floor. And if you want to know why now and why there is urgency on this issue, I'll tell the story I just heard from the gentleman from Red Wing. He said, we used to have maybe one person sleeping in the lobby who couldn't find a place to go. He said, inevitably, the people in the lobby were people who'd been in prison. He said, now we have 5. That's the impact. It's a growing issue, and we do affect the lives of people. So it's one little piece of what you've heard Tina and others say.
The governor has said that this doesn't rise to the level of a constitutional amendment. Now, I understand he doesn't have a say on that. Your Republican colleagues are likely not going to agree to put this on the ballot. If it were to even proceed in bill form, the governor would likely not sign it. How do you move forward on this?
Well, as I think Representative Metsa said, this is the beginning of a conversation. A constitutional amendment is what I am proposing. I thought about both ways, but I do think this belongs in the Constitution because this is about giving Minnesotans a right that I believe that they should have, and I think they believe they should have. I think, too, that, our Minnesota Constitution, for good or bad, has a lot of things in it that people don't think of as being in constitutions. It has a lot of funding things. We have certain funds set up in our Constitution. It's really different in some important ways from the federal Constitution. We have in it a right to hunt and fish. I think that we should have in it a right to use cannabis for personal use. I don't think that's inappropriate at all. Now, we know, too, that a governor can't veto a constitutional amendment. It does have to go through the legislature. Minnesota doesn't have a process for a popular referendum, unlike a lot of states that have done this. But I do think that, saying the legislature doesn't want to do it, the majority party maybe doesn't want to do it, I think citizens have a say in that. And knowing that something like this is out there, I think will encourage citizens around the state to contact their legislators. Legislators are supposed to respond to their constituency. Also, the party that says it's for small government, the party that says that we shouldn't be interfering in people's lives, this is a quintessential issue for that. I believe that, I would never say that cannabis is harmless. I don't believe it's harmless, but I do believe that prohibition of cannabis is much more harmful than the cannabis itself. And of course, we don't prohibit alcohol. We tried that in this country in a grand experiment, which was a dismal failure. It increased crime. It made criminals out of all kinds of innocent people. We're doing something similar with cannabis, and we need to stop.
We heard the number, about 10 to 21% of people use marijuana. How many people are ticketed? How many people are arrested? How many people are jailed?
So I have numbers here from 2015.
And these are Minnesota numbers.
This is Minnesota. Arrests for marijuana possession in Minnesota in 2015, 6,829. Then I have a figure here. Arrests for marijuana possession were more than a third of all drug arrests in Minnesota. 39% of all drug arrests in Minnesota were for marijuana. That's pretty stunning when you think of all the resources that are used for that could be used to go after other kinds of crimes.
Is this disproportionately minority populations?
Indeed, there's pretty good evidence that there is extreme racial disparity in enforcement in marijuana. So this is, let's see. So for 2008, so sometimes the data is a little bit in arrears. It's hard to get really current data. But in 2008, according to FBI data, the number of arrests for marijuana possession per 100,000 residents was 9.8 times higher for black Minnesotans than for white Minnesotans. So that is pretty astonishing. Now, I've seen other data. I don't know if I have it. So there's some suggestion that black Minnesotans perhaps use marijuana a little more frequently than white, like about 1.5 times as often. But that in no way accounts for that extreme disparity in arrests.
Repeat that again, I'm sorry.
So there's evidence that black Minnesotans use marijuana about 1.5 times, that their rates of marijuana use are about 1.5 times higher than white Minnesotans, but the arrests are much higher for black Minnesotans than for white Minnesotans.
What was the arrest disparity again?
So let's see, I had 9.8 times higher for black Minnesotans than white Minnesotans, and that was the 2008 data.
Representative Metsa, can I do a follow-up? Earlier you talked about your constituents, voters told you to be bold. Can you talk about the politics on this, particularly kind of the populism, the Trump populism sweeping the nation? Is this good politics for Democrats?
It's not about politics, it's about starting a conversation about what you can see from this group here and the authors on our bills is a vast representation of Minnesota districts across the state. And this is about being out there essentially and not being afraid of our own shadows here and the buttons we sit and press behind a desk. And people want us to take on some big issues. And I think the numbers you just heard are stunning. And I have heard stories from my constituents who had the opposite of being arrested. And the cop came to the door and they were in trouble for having a bag and dumped it out and said, come on, quit this stuff, you know? So how many of those people out there are the lucky ones that aren't going to have job problems and all the other ripple effects in your life that come from this? And so this is about starting from both sides. I want people to come to all of our offices and say, we really don't like this about your proposal, or we're vehemently against it for whatever reason, or for it. It's important for us to hear as lawmakers from people. And Minnesota doesn't have a process for a referendum. So a constitutional amendment when you're talking about the federal government, who we are challenging essentially in a little way, like many other states have before us. I think it's the right thing to do to bring it to voters and say, we're going to be on that list of states that can have this happen. And what is that interaction? We saw the Obama administration loosen the regulation and
But
enforcement.
couldn't this be good for Democrats in particular? It was not a great cycle for Democrats.
It could be good for anyone. I mean, I don't think this is a Republican-Democrat issue at all.
There's not a Republican out here about it.
No, but it doesn't mean that there are not Republicans who have personally used marijuana and feel the same way. In
Does
fact,
anybody have a Republican co-author?
Not yet. Look, this is not intended to be a partisan bill. We would like everyone who is interested to be on it, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise. So we're having those conversations. We'd love to have it be a bipartisan effort. And personally, in the past 24 hours since Brian Back's story and some of the other outlets picked this up, I've received over 1,000 contacts, whether it's phone calls, emails, text messages to my personal Facebook page, legislative pages, and 99.5% of those have been overwhelmingly supportive. And this is from Republicans, this is from young people, from old people, people from International Falls, Albert Lee, St. Paul, Wilmer, everywhere. It's an issue that a lot of people care about, of all political stripes, and ultimately we all believe, and I think many Minnesotans believe, that this policy will ultimately provide many benefits for the state of Minnesota.
I would just add one, can I add one thing to that? Sorry. I did seek out and ask Republicans, so you know, to be on the bill. This
And
wasn't,
they turned you down?
I have a few considering it.
Okay.
But yes, I was turned down.
We had someone in the front.
You had tweeted last week that it was pathetic how much time Doubt was spending on Sunday sales, and said that he should be focused on properly funding schools, tax relief, transportation, and bonding. How does marijuana fall above that list?
Well, the speaker is in charge, and he's made it very clear that whether it's his annual New Year's resolutions about Sunday sales, that it's a huge priority to him. I saw a video produced with these local celebrities that features Speaker Doubt. Meanwhile, last session came and went without a tax bill, without a bonding bill, without a transportation bill, which are priorities. And so why he keeps pushing the Sunday sales issue, to me, is pretty pathetic, because we have bigger problems and more critical responsibilities. This issue of marijuana is not one that it's not a priority for me or for us. Our priorities are making Minnesota better through education and transportation, tax relief, affordable health care, allowing people to retire securely, equal pay for equal work. But the speaker keeps insisting on Sunday sales. I mean, this is our 4th vote on it in 2 years. So if you really are all about freedom and liberty, and that's what you want to run your caucus like and want to run for governor on those principles, then maybe you should extend those same freedoms and liberties to what people can do in the comfort of their own home, whether it comes to women's healthcare choices or marrying the person they love, or if they can smoke marijuana every now and again. So,
do any of you up there smoke recreational marijuana now, or have you in the past?
I do not.
Have you in the past?
I have in the past.
What about each one of you?
I have in the past, yes. Not currently.
Well,
Isn't that the point?
yeah, really. Well, I, of course, as a young person, have smoked marijuana, but the thing is, I have no interest personally in smoking it. I visited my son who lives in Portland, Oregon, and went into one of the shops with him to see how the whole thing works. And frankly, I have no personal interest in it at all. But it's not about me. It's about the many, many Minnesotans who do have an interest in personal use. And so, you know, as most of you know, I do a lot of my work on health and human services. I think this is very consistent with that work. Because again, I'm not claiming that marijuana is harmless. In no way am I claiming that, but if we compare the harm of marijuana, which is really, it's really a pretty safe drug. Nobody has died of an overdose of marijuana. On the other hand, alcohol, which is freely available to adults, has a lot of harmful impacts, a lot of costs to society. So it really makes no sense at all to say that it's okay to have free purchase for adults of alcohol, but yet marijuana is too dangerous for people to be able to use when they want to, for what use they want to. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Time for one or two more. Have you heard from the doctors in your district on this? If you addressed this earlier, I missed it.
I didn't address it earlier. You know, physicians have different opinions about it. I know that some of the doctors in my district are probably not in favor of this. I do know that there's some thought that for people with mental illness, for example, I mean, it can have some harmful impact on some people. But my goodness, look at the harm that alcohol has. Also, I feel very strongly that the prohibition itself is really harmful to Minnesotans. There is some evidence from states that have allowed people to use marijuana for personal use or for pain relief, that opioid deaths are dropping in those states. Why? Because people are probably substituting marijuana for opioids, and marijuana is so much safer than opioids. So am I claiming that marijuana, you can never be addicted? No, I'm not claiming that. Am I claiming that everyone should be able to use it safely? No, I'm not claiming that. But prohibition itself is really hurting Minnesota, and I believe that if we remove the prohibition, we can do some careful regulation. I would use the tax money for education, for chemical dependency treatment, for mental health treatment, so that the impacts, the negative impacts, can be minimized. But I think that overall, this would be really a much better place for the state to be, not wasting our money, arresting people, and throwing them in jail and ruining a lot of lives, and all the racial disparities, which for Minnesota is a huge issue. We know that racial disparities in this state are just really shameful.
Have impaired drivers under the influence of marijuana caused fatal accidents, do you think? Do you have any statistics on that?
Well, I don't have statistics on that, but I do know that in states that have legalized, that have removed the prohibition, that they are not seeing an increase in fatalities. Now, it's already illegal to drive under the influence, and it should certainly remain illegal. Whatever you're using, whether the substance is legal or not. But we have far more crash impacts from alcohol than we do from marijuana even now. But let's just be real. People are using marijuana. This is not about are people going to use it or not. They are using it. The problem is they're buying it on the black market, where they don't know if it's contaminated or not. Buying it is putting them into contact with the criminal element, because that's how you buy it. And they don't know the strength of what they're buying. So we can deal with all of those issues, make it safer for the consumer, and really use the money to mitigate the impacts that there are.
Representative Hausman, you were the only one we hadn't heard from. Have you used recreational marijuana in the past?
I'm not a smoker of anything.
Never have been?
Where then do you draw the line? You said people are using marijuana, people are also using heroin, they're using meth. Why make marijuana the point of conversation rather than other illicit drugs?
It's not legal.
Well,
Yes.
marijuana is an objectively non-dangerous drug. No one has ever overdosed on marijuana. No one has ever died on account of marijuana usage. Marijuana doesn't result in reckless or dangerous, belligerent behavior. And those other substances that you mentioned do. So, as I mentioned yesterday, I'd like to see all of the tax proceeds derived from regulation go towards the public schools, but I think some should also be set aside for education and awareness for actually serious drugs like opioids, in which there's an incredible epidemic, not just in Minnesota, but around the country, drugs that are actually serious, that actually ruin people's lives. Marijuana is not one of those drugs.
And do you have Senate co-authors for any of these?
We are getting Senate co-authors.
So for none of these right now, do you have it?
At this moment, we do not.
Representative Authority, then David Crosby has called marijuana a gateway drug. Do you disagree with that assertion?
Yes,
Well,
alcohol is a gateway drug.
I'm not a doctor nor a scientist, but I studied the issue, and I'm going to take my cues from the World Health Organization, which concludes otherwise, and not whomever you mentioned, or Representative Cornish, who believes that it's a gateway drug. The World Health Organization does not, so do most scientific and medical publications and actual authorities.
All right, thanks, guys.
I would just say on the gateway part of it that what you're doing, if we continue the prohibition, is putting someone in a position where if they're choosing to use this, which is a good segment of the population here in the state and across the country, in a situation where they're going to someone who would likely have other products for sale. And this would be a responsible way as lawmakers for us to prohibit it from becoming a gateway drug, if that's a perception that Crosby has. And I have a friend I want to share a story about, because he was in a car accident at about 18, broke his back, got addicted to opioids, ended up in jail. One of the smartest kids I know. And it's constituents like him that I think about. He recently got out. That we know that there are major issues with addiction with this stuff. And we also know that with cannabis in a raw form, that it's much safer than the medical derived products of it, because that's where you get the extremely high content of THC and the other chemicals in there. And I heard from a pharmacist in my district yesterday who said that only Minnesota could screw up medical marijuana, because you took something that we know that can be eaten or smoked, and you made it harder to get than moon rocks and processed the heck out of it with other chemicals. Why would you do that? And I was expecting, I know the pharmacist well, for it to be the exact opposite comment and kind of critiquing me more for starting a statewide conversation. And that's the exact feedback and reason we're here today, is to get input from people. So we hope that, this conference floods our inboxes for all the legislators across the state here, and that we can start a conversation and then go and do our due diligence and meet with law enforcement, meet with doctors and attorneys, and get more studies specifically here that we can all research together and put together a proposal that is actually the best one we can come up with together. But we can't do that without starting the conversation. So we appreciate you coming to do that.
Thank you all.
Thank you.